Welcome to Level Up Mechanics. My name is Chris, and in today's video we'll be installing some ditch lights and a wire harness assembly provided by LasFit. If you are interested in these items that we'll be going over today, you can use the code LEVELUP10 on LasFit's website, which will give you 10% off on the ditch lights and the wire harness that they have for the 3rd gen Toyota Tacoma. And then in addition to the ditch lights and the wire harness, we're also going to install some ditch light brackets that are available from Diode Dynamics. I'll also provide some links in the description below in regards to the items that we'll be installing today. But with that said, let's go ahead and jump into the install. So here's everything I think I'm going to need in order to install the ditch lights onto the 3rd gen Toyota Tacoma. To start off with, we actually have the LasFit ditch lights over here. These are their HP ditch lights that they have available in a flood style. They do offer a couple of different options as far as the light output is concerned, but I went ahead and got the white flood HP ditch lights from LasFit. One thing to note with the LasFit ditch lights, you kind of have to buy everything separately. So when you buy the ditch lights, you're also going to need to buy the actual wire harness assembly separately in order to power the ditch lights. And then in addition, you're going to have to buy a set of ditch light brackets separately as well. I purchased these ditch light brackets from Diode Dynamics, so I'll be utilizing those on the hood in order to install the ditch lights. I also went ahead and purchased some amber lenses to swap out for the ditch lights. I know they look green right now, but that's just a protective film to prevent scratches during shipping. And then with the wiring harness, it does have a generic style button that is installed with the wiring harness. I'm actually going to cut that button out of the wiring harness and install this OEM-Style switch that I purchased off of Amazon. The generic button actually has 3 wires going to it. There's a red wire, a yellow wire, and a black wire. The only wire that I'm really going to need for this setup is the red wire, because that is the signal wire that goes to the relay to command the relay on in order to power the ditch lights. If you want to learn more about how I wire up these OEM-Style switches, I do have another video on my channel that goes over how I installed the switches onto the Tacoma. So make sure to check that video out if you decide that you want to replace the generic looking button on this wiring harness with an OEM-Style switch. So in addition to all of the items needed in order to install the ditch lights, we have some tools that we're going to be using. First off, I have my little case of different electrical accessories, of fittings and connectors and crimp items that I'll be using. I also have some heat shrink tube that I'll be using when I make modifications to this wiring harness. I'm going to use an impact driver, some electrical tape. I also have some zip ties over here, and then a heat gun in order to shrink the heat shrink tube. Then I have an assortment of 3/8 and a 1/4 inch socket set. And then obviously I have my ratchets and a wire crimper stripper tool, and then some Allen wrenches and a Phillips screwdriver just in case. Hopefully this is everything that I need. If not, I will definitely make sure to add the other tools that I may use during the process of this video. But now that we've gone over everything, I think the first step I'm going to do is to install these ditch light brackets onto the 3rd gen Tacoma. These are going to be bolted up to the hood hinges, one on each side. So let's start the process and get these ditch light brackets installed onto the hood of the Tacoma. So here you see that I've installed the ditch light bracket on the driver's side of the hood hinge. You can tell right here where I have the bolts already run through. I just used a 12mm socket and a 3/8 ratchet in order to loosen the bolts and install the bracket. The instructions do say that you want to use masking tape to line out the actual hood hinge when you go to install the bracket, so that way you align the hood correctly so it shuts correctly. I actually just used the dirt and all the stuff that's already sort of located between the hinge and the hood to use as my lining point for reinstalling the bolts with the ditch light bracket connected to it. If you do want to do this yourself and you are unsure of the alignment of the hood, I highly recommend using masking tape to mask out the outline of the hood hinge. However, I really didn't need to, since it was kind of dirty in between the hinge and the hood. I just used that natural outline in order to reinstall the hood hinge onto the hood with the ditch light bracket already installed there. And you can see with this ditch light bracket, the driver's side, it goes down and it kind of curves up. And then on the other side right here, you'll see it curves up and then points outward towards you. That indicates that this is for the driver's side, and the other side will obviously be the passenger side. So let me go ahead and do the passenger side real quick, and then we'll move on to the next step. Now that we have both brackets installed, one on each side of the hood hinge, the next step you should do is to test to make sure that your hood is actually aligned properly and closes properly. I would highly recommend just letting the hood hit the first safety latch in order to make sure that it connects properly, and then just sort of double check around the edges to make sure that the hood lines actually lined up with your fender. And if everything looks good, go ahead and close your hood all the way at that point and make sure that the hood is sort of lined up with your fender lines as well, just to double check to make sure that you got the alignment correct. So now that the ditch light brackets are installed, the next step I want to do is actually install the wiring harness to the truck. Before I even try to install the ditch lights, I want to wire everything up correctly, and so that way when I install the ditch lights, I can test and make sure that they're working properly. Now with the wiring harness right here, again we have this generic style switch, has 3 wires that go to it. There is a red wire, a yellow wire, and a black wire. If you decide to use this generic switch, that's perfectly fine and it will work just fine. But from what I've seen with the wiring harness, it looks like the red wire that goes to the switch is the signal wire that activates the relay to send power to the ditch lights. So all I need is this red wire, as I've already got all my OEM-style switches already installed and prepped and ready to go. So we'll be installing this switch and then just using the red wire from this basic switch right here and hooking it up to the OEM-style ditch light switch that I have right here. Again, if you want to learn more about these switches, make sure to check out my other video as I go over how I wired these all up and installed them on the Tacoma. But in the meantime, with this wiring harness, you're going to have your positive lead and your negative lead. The red would be connected to the positive battery cable, and the black would be connected either to the negative battery cable or the ground point that is right next to the battery. So I'm going to go ahead and get this all put on so you don't have to watch the boring details of it, and then I'll go over how I install this wiring harness and show you the finished results. So far I've installed the switch and run the red wire from the wiring harness from the basic switch and connected it through the firewall and back to the OEM wiring harness. So now that I have the switch portion set up right here, I need to finish wiring up the rest of the wiring harness. Basically all I need to do is install the red wire to the positive side of the battery, the black wire to the negative side of the battery or to a ground point. Here is my switch assembly. I know it's a little hard to see, but here's my switch assembly, and I had my red wire that went from the wiring harness with the basic switch hooked up to my actual ditch light switch right here. And as you can see, when I turn it on, it does light up red, and that's because I've already pre-wired these switches so that when I add an accessory, all I have to do is one wire connection and then we're good to go. Alright, so I plugged in the ditch light right here. You can see it's connected at this connector piece right here for the wire harness. Let's go ahead and press the ditch light switch and see if this light actually turns on. Let's go ahead and press the ditch light switch and see if the ditch lights actually come on. And sure enough, it is powered up. So everything's wired in correctly. So now that we know that the ditch lights work, the next step will be to route the rest of the wiring harness so that each connector for the ditch light is near the ditch light brackets on each side. So I'm going to route the wiring. I'm probably going to just route it across this OEM wiring harness that goes along the firewall and just zip tie it to this wiring harness. And then for each connector, I'll probably run it underneath the front cowl in order to hide the wires as much as possible, so that way the connector can reach the ditch lights on each side by the ditch light brackets. The next step is going to be to assemble the ditch light brackets onto the actual ditch lights themselves. So here you can see that I've got everything laid out, all of the hardware, including the ditch light, the bracket, and all of the retaining hardware, and same for over on this side as well. When we install the brackets onto the ditch light, you can see how the ditch light has a natural curve going this way. You're going to actually install the bracket to follow the same type of curve. So the first step when installing the brackets onto the ditch light, we're actually going to take the bracket and line it up with this side hole right here. And on one side, before we add the bracket, we are going to install or place a washer, not like that, but we're going to place a washer on top of the hole like so. And we'll take one of these side bolts right here and we will put a lock washer on first, then a regular washer, and now we're ready to line the bolt into place. Try not to knock that washer that's just sitting on top of the ditch light out of place, and we'll thread the bolt in a little loose on the side by hand, and then we'll flip it over and do the same thing to the other side. Now that we have both threaded in by hand, we'll just tighten both sides till it gets close to being actually snug. We want to keep it a little loose so that way once we have them installed onto the ditch light brackets, then we can make any adjustments necessary in order to point the light in the direction we want them to be pointed in. Next, we're going to set up the bottom bolt, which will go through the bracket at the bottom and bolt onto the ditch light brackets that are already connected to the hood hinges. And then once you put this bolt through the hood bracket on the bottom side, you will have your nut, your lock washer, and your flat washer bolt onto the bottom of the bolt. So I'm going to go ahead and get the other side prepped as well, and then I will bolt these up to the actual hood brackets and we'll move on to the next step. So I used a wrench to tighten the nut at the bottom of the bolt to tighten the bracket in the ditch light to the hood bracket, and you'll want to make your final adjustments at nighttime when you can aim these ditch lights and see the direction that they're going. So I'm going to leave them kind of snug for right now, and at nighttime I'll make my final adjustments in order to point the lights in the direction that I want them to be pointed at. And all that's left really is to go ahead and plug these lights in, finish routing the wiring underneath the front hood cowl, and secure the wiring harness to the vehicle, at which point I'll be able to demonstrate how well these perform at nighttime. That's going to do it for this install. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Later.